Chapter 1. The Job Offer. Setting the stage. The email came through at 8:47 p.m., just as I was about to close my laptop for the night. At first, I thought it was spam, sent from a name I didn't recognize with a subject line that read, "Only, exclusive opportunity." But desperation has a way of lowering your guard. I was down to my last $100, my tuition was past due, and I'd been rejected by every entry-level nannying position I'd applied to that month. Clicking felt inevitable. The email was succinct but tantalizing. A high-profile client is seeking a discreet and experienced caregiver. Compensation, $5,000 per week. Submit your interest to proceed. $5,000 a week. I thought it had to be a scam or a cruel joke, but the agency name caught my attention. Vanguard Staffing. I'd seen their ads before, always targeting the elite. Rumor had it they staffed the nannies, personal chefs, and assistants for the one-percenters, CEOs, celebrities, and politicians. Even so, I hesitated. It seemed too good to be true, and in my experience, too good to be true usually came with strings attached. Still, what choice did I have? My stomach tightened as I typed out a polite reply and hit send. The regret came instantly, like it always does after making a hasty decision. But what was the harm? If it didn't pan out, I'd just keep struggling like always. The response came within hours, faster than I expected. It was formal and direct, detailing a brief virtual interview with one of their coordinators the next day. I couldn't sleep that night, my mind racing with what-ifs. Who could the client be? What did it feel like my life might change forever? The interview was strange. The coordinator, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, peppered me with questions. Had I ever worked with children before? Could I handle high-pressure environments? How was I with following strict rules? Each question felt like it was probing something deeper, though I couldn't tell what. At the end, she asked, almost as an afterthought, "How comfortable are you with confidentiality?" "Very," I replied, my voice steady despite the knot forming in my stomach. She nodded, scribbling something down before glancing up at me. "This position comes with certain expectations. Should you be selected, you'll need to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Violating it carries severe penalties." "What kind of penalties?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Her gaze didn't waver. "Financial, legal, and reputational," she said. Then, as if to soften the blow, she added, "But our clients are generous. You'll be well compensated." When she told me the client was Sean "Diddy" Combs, my breath caught. His name carried a weight I couldn't ignore. Music mogul, cultural icon, untouchable figure. The opportunity seemed too surreal to pass up. By the end of the call, I had agreed to the terms. A sleek black envelope arrived at my door the next morning with a contract, the NDA, and a letter confirming my start date. The day of the job came quickly. A black SUV pulled up to my apartment building, its windows tinted so dark I couldn't see the driver. The man who stepped out wore a tailored suit and a Bluetooth headset, his expression a mask of professionalism. He opened the back door without a word, and I slid inside, clutching my bag tightly. The drive felt endless. We left the city and wound through private roads lined with manicured hedges and imposing gates. When we finally arrived, the estate was a fortress of modern opulence, massive yet cold. Tall iron gates opened mechanically as we approached, and the gravel driveway crunched under the wheels like whispers of warning. The house itself was a masterpiece of architecture, all clean lines, glass walls, and impossibly high ceilings. It looked more like an art gallery than a home, the kind of place where every corner screamed wealth, but lacked any warmth. Inside, the feeling of unease grew. The staff greeted me with practiced politeness, their smiles sharp and fleeting. I was introduced to the head of household staff, a man named Mr. Greaves. He was older, with a voice as smooth as silk and eyes that seemed to dissect me with every glance. "Miss Bennett?" he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, but impersonal. "Welcome to the Combs estate. I trust you've read the rules?" "Yes," I said, though I wasn't sure if I had fully absorbed them. The list had been extensive. No personal phone use during working hours. No entering certain areas of the house. No speaking to the press under any circumstances. It felt like preparing for a military operation, rather than babysitting. "Good," he said, gesturing for me to follow him. As we walked through the grand hallways, I couldn't help but notice the precision with which the staff moved. Everyone had a purpose, their movements almost robotic. It was as if the house itself dictated their every action. Finally, we stopped in front of a set of double doors. Mr. Greaves turned to me, his expression unreadable. "This is where you'll spend most of your time, the child's quarters. Remember, your role here is to provide care and stability. Nothing more, nothing less. Do not overstep." I nodded, swallowing hard. His words lingered in the air as he opened the doors, revealing a room that was both lavish and oddly sterile. Toys and books were arranged meticulously on shelves, and the bed was perfectly made. It felt staged, like a display in a high-end catalog. And then I saw the child. They were sitting on the edge of the bed, their small frame dwarfed by the oversized furniture. "Hello," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm here to take care of you." "Ça va?" The child didn't respond, only tilting their head slightly as if studying me. Mr. Greaves cleared his throat, pulling my attention back to him. "You'll find everything you need here. Dinner will be served at 7. Enjoy your evening." And with that he left, closing the doors behind him. I was alone with the child, in a house that already felt like it was swallowing me whole. Chapter 2. The Child. The first thing I noticed about the child was how still they were. Not just the usual shyness you'd expect from a kid meeting someone new, but the kind of stillness that makes you wonder if they're scared of something. They sat on the edge of the bed, legs dangling just above the floor, their little hands gripping the blanket like it might slip away. I tried to break the tension, introducing myself and asking a few easy questions. "What do you like to do for fun? Do you have a favorite game?" But they barely responded, just nodding or shrugging, their eyes darting between me and the closed door. It was like they were waiting for permission to speak, or maybe just afraid to say the wrong thing. The unease only deepened when Mr. Greaves returned a little while later with a printed list in his hand. He placed it on the desk, tapping it twice like it was some kind of sacred text. "These are the rules for the child's care. Review them carefully," he said, before leaving without another word. The list was a lot, and the basics seemed normal enough. Meal times, nap schedules, and bedtime. But then, it got weird. The child had to be in specific rooms at certain times of the day, no exceptions. They weren't allowed to watch TV or use any screens, which struck me as odd for a kid this age. And bedtime? 8 o'clock sharp. Not 8:01, not even 7:59. It felt more like managing a high-profitable client than babysitting. One line caught my eye and made my stomach drop. "Do not discuss the watchers with the child." I reread it 3 times, trying to make sense of it. Watchers? I glanced over at the kid, now quietly sorting through a box of puzzles like they were on autopilot. The word lingered in my head, heavy and unsettling. I didn't dare ask them about it. Not yet, anyway. As the day went on, I started to pick up on the child's quirks. They flinched at sudden sounds, even small ones like a door creaking or my shoe squeaking on the polished floor. They also stuck to a routine so rigid it felt unnatural. After dinner, which was delivered by a silent staff member, the child methodically brushed their teeth for exactly 2 minutes. Then they lined up their slippers perfectly at the foot of the bed before climbing under the covers. In the Abbey, after my mother had walked past me squeaking heels from the stairs. "Good night," I said softly, but they didn't respond. They just stared at the ceiling until their eyes eventually fluttered shut. That's when I noticed the cameras. There were at least 2 in the room, both barely noticeable unless you were really looking. One was mounted discreetly in the corner near the ceiling, and the other was tucked into the base of a lamp. They were angled to capture the entire room, including the child's bed, and mine. My stomach churned at the thought of being watched, but I told myself it was just a security thing. Rich people and their paranoia, right? It had to be normal for a house like this. I climbed into my own bed across the room, determined to shake off the weirdness. But as the night stretched on, the house seemed to take on a life of its own. The faint hum of the security system buzzed in my ears, and every creak of the floorboards sent my heart racing. At one point, I could have sworn I heard whispers, soft, almost imperceptible, like voices murmuring behind the walls. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe the staff moving around, even though it sounded too deliberate for that. I pulled the covers tighter and tried to sleep, but the feeling of being watched lingered, stronger than ever. At first, I found it satiating, like licking a cat's. The next morning, I tried to ease into my routine with the child. Breakfast was quiet, almost painfully so, with them eating slowly and neatly, like they were being graded on their manners. I asked if they wanted to play outside or read a book together, but they shook their head and retreated to their playroom. The playroom was beautiful, of course. Walls lined with shelves of pristine toys and books that looked barely touched. But there was something cold about it, like it had been designed for show rather than actual use. The child sat cross-legged on a plush rug, building a tower out of wooden blocks. For a while, I just watched, unsure of how to connect with them. Then, out of nowhere, they looked up and said, "Do the Watchers talk to you?" My blood ran cold. The way they said it was so casual, like they were asking about the weather. I scrambled for a response, but before I could say anything, they went back to stacking their blocks, as if the question had never happened. When I brought it up to one of the staff members later, just a passing mention, nothing too direct, they brushed it off like it was nothing. "Children have vivid imaginations," they said with a smile that didn't quite reach their eyes. I wouldn't worry about it, but I did worry. Because the more time I spent in that house, the more I started to feel it too. The Watchers, or whatever they were. It was like the cameras weren't the only things keeping tabs on me. Every shadow, every flicker of light, every faint noise felt loaded with intent. And no matter how hard I tried to convince myself otherwise, the unease only grew stronger. By the end of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I didn't know what I'd signed up for, but it was becoming painfully clear that this wasn't just a babysitting job. Whatever was happening in this house, it went deeper than I could have imagined. Just grab some map kits. Chapter 3, Unsettling Behavior. By the third day, the child's quirks started to cross into unsettling territory. The first thing that struck me was their refusal to enter the library. It was a grand space, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, ornate woodwork, and thick velvet drapes. But every time we passed by it, the child tensed up. They would tug at my sleeve or quietly shake their head, silently begging to avoid it. At first, I thought it was just a kid thing. Maybe the dark corners of the library spooked them. But when I casually suggested we read a storybook together in there, they froze completely. "No," they whispered, their voice trembling. "They don't like it when we go in there." I knelt to their level, trying to reassure them. Who doesn't like it?" I asked gently. But the child only clammed up, refusing to meet my gaze. Their behavior became stranger as the day wore on. They muttered cryptic phrases under their breath, things like, "They're watching us now," or "It's not safe to laugh too much." It wasn't just the words, it was how they said them, like they were reciting something they'd been told. Each sentence sent a chill crawling up my spine. And then there was the stuffed animal. It was unlike any toy I'd ever seen, clearly handmade, with mismatched button eyes and a crooked stitched smile. Its fabric was faded, patched together from scraps of different materials, giving it a ragged, almost sinister appearance. The child clung to it obsessively, refusing to go anywhere or sleep without it. When I asked about the stuffed animal, they simply said, "It keeps them away." "Who?" I asked, but again, they shut down completely. The house itself wasn't helping my nerves. During the day, the sprawling estate felt too perfect, too quiet. The staff moved around like ghosts, their footsteps muted on the plush carpets. They rarely spoke, and when they did, it was only in clipped, polite tones. Eye contact seemed to be something they avoided altogether, which only added to the oppressive atmosphere. Some hallways and rooms were clearly off limits. Doors with heavy locks and no labels were scattered throughout the house, and I noticed certain areas were always guarded by staff. Once, I lingered too long near one of these doors, and a housekeeper appeared out of nowhere, standing between me and the entrance with a polite but firm smile. "Miss, that area is restricted," they said, their tone leaving no room for argument. I nodded, muttering an apology as I backed away, but my curiosity only grew. What was behind those doors? That night, everything escalated. After dinner, the child seemed unusually tense, their little hands trembling as they worked on a puzzle in their playroom. I tried to engage them, asking if they wanted to read or play a game, but they just shook their head. "It's better if we're quiet," they whispered. The words sent a shiver through me, but I didn't push. I figured they were just tired, or at least, that's what I told myself. Around 9 p.m., just as I was about to settle them into bed, the child suddenly bolted across the room and dove under a table. They curled up into a tight ball, clutching their stuffed animal so hard I thought it might tear apart. "Hey," I said, rushing over and crouching beside them. "What's wrong? Did something happen?" "They don't like it when we laugh too much," they whispered, their voice barely audible. "We laughed too much today." My throat tightened as I tried to process what they were saying. "Who doesn't like it?" "Them," they said, pointing vaguely toward the ceiling. I glanced up, my heart pounding, but of course, there was nothing there. Just the faint hum of the overhead lights and the quiet creak of the house settling. I tried to calm them, gently coaxing them out from under the table. But the unease in their eyes didn't fade. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every noise amplified in the oppressive silence of the house. The creak of footsteps in the hallway made my stomach knot, even though I knew it was probably just the staff. The faint whispering sound returned, but this time it seemed closer, almost like it was coming from the walls themselves. I told myself it was just my imagination. The house was old and old houses made noises, right? But deep down, I didn't believe that. The next morning, while the child was occupied with their blocks, I noticed something strange in the playroom. One of the walls had an odd seam, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. It ran vertically, splitting the wall into two uneven sections, almost like the outline of a door. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pressed my hand against the seam, running my fingers along the edges. The surface felt slightly colder than the rest of the wall, and there was a faint, almost imperceptible gap. "What are you doing?" The child's voice startled me, and I turned to see them standing behind me, clutching their stuffed animal tightly. "Just..." Their eyes widened and they took a step back. "Don't touch it," they said urgently. "You're not supposed to." Palm branches crackled underfoot, ripe with spider webs, and slowly snaked around them. Before I could ask why, the door to the playroom opened and Mr. Greaves entered. His sharp gaze immediately locked onto me, and his expression darkened. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone polite but icy. I shook my head quickly. "No, just looking around." Her calm descended. He didn't respond, but his eyes lingered on the wall for a moment before he turned to the child. "It's time for your music lesson," he said, extending a hand. The child hesitated, glancing at me before reluctantly taking his hand. As they left the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Greaves knew exactly what I'd been looking at, and that he wasn't happy about it. Chapter 4: Surveillance and Isolation. The uneasy rhythm of my days at the estate began to shift, though not in any way that brought comfort. It started small, moments that I could brush off as imagination if I tried hard enough. When I walked down a hallway, I'd catch glimpses of the staff watching me out of the corners of their eyes, their faces blank, but their focus unmistakable. Conversations would stop abruptly when I entered a room, the air thick with the unspoken weight of something I wasn't privy to. The cameras, though, were impossible to ignore. They were everywhere, mounted discreetly in corners, tucked into ornate light fixtures, and even perched above door frames. At first, I'd assumed they were standard security measures, but the more I noticed them, the more invasive they felt. They weren't just there to monitor the estate. They were watching us. One morning, while helping the child with their breakfast, I noticed a red light blinking from a tiny lens embedded in the chandelier above the dining table. My skin prickled as I realized it wasn't just trained on the room. It was pointed directly at the child's chair. I couldn't stop thinking about it. One afternoon during the child's piano lesson, I wandered into a side room near the kitchen. It was a cramped space, filled with a dizzying array of monitors and blinking lights. I froze when I realized what I was looking at: the house's security feed. The screens displayed every corner of the estate in crisp, high-definition detail. The ballroom, the library, the grounds, all of it laid out in real time. But then I noticed something odd. I clicked down to view the footage of their progress. One of the screens showed the child's playroom, but the angle was wrong. It wasn't from one of the cameras I'd seen mounted in the corners. This one was lower, closer, as if it were coming from inside the room itself. The image on the screen was of me sitting on the floor with the child the previous evening. My stomach churned. I remembered that moment vividly. I'd been sitting by the toy chest, reading to them from a picture book. But I hadn't seen any camera at that level, and the angle suggested it was hidden somewhere near the child's eyeline. Before I could process the implications, another screen caught my eye. It showed my bedroom. My chest tightened as I realized the camera was hidden in the air vent above the bed. The feed showed me sitting at the desk, writing in my journal the night before. The sound of footsteps in the hallway snapped me out of my horror. I quickly ducked out of the room, my heart racing. As I hurried back to the playroom, my thoughts spiraled. The cameras weren't just about protecting the house. They were about control, and I was as much a subject of that control as the child. That evening, something happened that shifted the unease into outright fear. Diddy made an appearance. It was the first time I'd seen him in person, and his presence was as magnetic as it was unnerving. He entered the room with a quiet confidence, his tailored suit impeccable, his smile warm but somehow disarming. "You must be the new nanny," he said, his voice smooth and commanding. "I trust you're settling in well." I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral. "Yes, thank you." His gaze lingered on me, sharp and assessing, as if he were peeling back layers to see what lay beneath. "Good," he said finally. "We value trust in this house. Trust and discretion. It's what keeps everything running smoothly." His words felt loaded, though I couldn't pinpoint why. He didn't stay long, excusing himself after a brief exchange with the head of staff. But the weight of his presence lingered long after he was gone. That night, as I was tucking the child into bed, they reached out and grabbed my wrist. Their small hand was cold, their grip surprisingly firm. "Don't go near the red room," they whispered, their wide eyes glistening in the dim light. "The red room?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The child nodded, their gaze flicking toward the door as if afraid someone might be listening. "That's where the bad things happen." I wanted to press them for more, but they pulled the covers over their head, retreating into silence. Later, as I sat in my room, their words echoed in my mind. The estate was massive, with countless rooms I hadn't explored. Could the red room be behind one of those locked doors? And if so, what made it so dangerous? The paranoia that had been building since I arrived reached a fever pitch. The cameras, the whispers, the child's warnings. It all pointed to something sinister lurking beneath the estate's polished exterior. And now, I was in too deep to turn back. Chapter 5. The Red Room. The warning the child had whispered to me gnawed at my thoughts, replaying endlessly in my mind. Don't go near the red room. That's where the bad things happen. It wasn't the sort of thing you could simply dismiss, not with everything else I'd seen and felt in this house. The cameras, the unnerving staff, and the weight of something unspoken hanging over every interaction. It all pointed to secrets that no one wanted uncovered. That night I couldn't sleep. The child's words had planted a seed of curiosity that grew into an insistent urge. The rational part of me screamed to stay put, to follow the rules, to keep my head down and finish the job. But the oppressive atmosphere of the house made it impossible to let it go. I had to know. Around midnight, when the house had fallen into an eerie silence, I slipped out of my room. The hallways were dimly lit, shadows stretching long against the ornate walls. Every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet felt deafening, and I paused at every corner, listening for footsteps or voices. The restricted part of the house was on the east wing, a section I'd never been assigned to and that I'd deliberately avoided out of caution. It was separated from the rest of the estate by a heavy oak door, always locked. Tonight, to my surprise, it was ajar. Beyond the door, the hallway was darker, the walls painted in deeper tones, almost as if the space was designed to discourage lingering. As I moved deeper into the wing, I noticed a faint glow coming from the end of the corridor, a red light, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. The source of the glow was a door, sleek and modern, out of place against the otherwise classic design of the house. There were no ornate carvings or brass handles, just a smooth surface painted deep crimson. The faint sound of music filtered through, so low it was barely audible, more like a hum that vibrated in my chest than a melody I could distinguish. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door. There were no cameras in this corridor, at least none that I could see. It struck me as odd. This house had cameras in every corner, yet this area was free of surveillance. It felt deliberate, as though someone would see what happened here. The door was locked, but the handle gave slightly under pressure, like it hadn't been secured properly. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my ears, and pushed it open. The room was unlike anything I'd expected. The red lighting cast everything in a surreal glow, making shadows dance on the walls. The air was cold, almost unnaturally so, and carried a faint metallic scent that made my stomach turn. The furniture was sparse but expensive. Leather chairs, a low coffee table, and a sleek cabinet against one wall. At first glance, it seemed like just another extravagant room in an already excessive house, but the longer I stood there, the more wrong it felt. On the coffee table, I noticed a child's drawing. It was crude, like something any 6 or 7-year-old might make, but the subject matter sent a chill down my spine. The stick figures were small and huddled together, surrounded by tall, shadowy shapes with long limbs and hollow eyes. One of the figures had what looked like tears drawn in thick, uneven blue lines. Scrawled at the bottom in messy handwriting were the words, "They watch us." I picked it up, my hands trembling slightly, and turned to the cabinet. It was locked, but one of the drawers had been left slightly open. Inside were notebooks, the pages filled with erratic handwriting. The words were difficult to decipher, but phrases jumped out at me. "Do as you're told," "never ask," and "don't laugh too much." There were lists, names, and dates, though I didn't recognize any of them. Next to the notebooks was a small stuffed animal, clearly well-loved. It was worn and patched in places, with button eyes and frayed stitching. Its odd shape gave it an unsettling appearance, like something handmade by someone who wasn't entirely sure what a toy should look like. I recognized it immediately. It was the same one the child insisted on keeping with them at all times, the one they clung to like a lifeline. As I set the toy down, my eyes caught a faint seam along the wall near the corner of the room. It looked like a panel, slightly out of alignment with the rest of the wall. On a hunch, I pressed against it. With a soft click, it swung open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside were rows of tapes and labeled files. My stomach twisted as I read the labels: nanny interviews, staff compliance logs, observation sessions. I picked up one of the tapes, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The label on it read simply, March 12-incident. I didn't dare play it, not here, but I knew I needed to take something. Whatever this room was, it wasn't meant to be seen, and the files inside it were proof that something deeply wrong was happening in this house. I grabbed one of the thinner folders, slipping it into my sweater, and closed the compartment as quietly as I could. As I turned to leave, a figure filled the doorway. It was one of the household staff, a man I recognized from the kitchen, though I'd never heard him speak a word. His expression was cold, his eyes narrowing as they scanned the room. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and steady. My throat went dry. I got lost," I stammered, though it was clear he didn't believe me. He stepped closer, his frame blocking the exit. "This part of the house is off limits for a reason," he said. "People who go where they're not supposed to tend to regret it." I backed away instinctively, clutching the file under my sweater. The room suddenly felt smaller, the red light oppressive. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "For your own good, forget what you saw. If you don't," he trailed off, letting the weight of the unspoken threat settle over me. "Life." He didn't move to stop me as I edged past him, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I didn't run, though every instinct screamed at me to. Instead, I walked as calmly as I could back down the hallway, the weight of the file pressing against my chest like a stone. When I finally reached my room and locked the door behind me, I collapsed onto the bed, shaking. The image of the child's drawing, the words in the notebooks, and the man's warning all churned in my mind. Whatever was happening in this house, it wasn't just strange or unsettling, it was dangerous. And now, I wasn't sure I could leave even if I wanted to. Well, Chapter 6, A Fractured Reality. The next morning, everything felt different. The house seemed colder, the air heavier. The staff, who had always been distant, now seemed outright hostile. They barely spoke to me, and when they did, it was curt and clipped, their smiles replaced by thin-lipped stares. It wasn't long before one of them approached me while I was in the kitchen, their tone sharp. "Hand over your phone," they said, holding out their hand like it was a routine request. I froze. "Why?" I haven't. It's for security reasons, they interrupted, their eyes narrowing. Standard protocol. The edge in their voice told me there was no room for argument. Reluctantly, I handed it over, feeling an unsettling pang of vulnerability as the device left my hand. Now, I was truly cut off. No contact with the outside world, no way to call for help if things escalated further. The child, too, had changed. Their usual quiet demeanor had taken on a new layer of fear. They clung to me more than ever, their little hands gripping my sleeve tightly whenever we were alone. Their whispered comments grew darker, more desperate. Giveaways leave as we watched them banging trays of wine against the rim of our plate. I reached for some context to explain what had happened. I tried to reassure them, forcing a smile. It's okay. We're safe here. But they shook their head vigorously, tears welling in their eyes. No, we're not. They don't like it when we ask to leave. They don't like it when we're too happy, either. My stomach churned at their words. Who's they? I asked softly. The child looked at me like I'd asked the most foolish question imaginable. The Watchers, they whispered. They're everywhere. They worship you. That night, as I tucked the child into bed, I felt the weight of their words settle heavily over me. The room felt colder than usual, and the faint hum of the cameras seemed louder, almost invasive. I tried to ignore it as I sang them a lullaby, hoping to ease their obvious anxiety. But as I turned off the light and closed the door behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, closer than ever before. To walk down the hallway, the silence of the house pressing in on me. The dim lighting seemed to cast longer shadows than it should have, and every creak of the floorboards sent a shiver down my spine. Just as I passed the main staircase, something caught my eye. A shadow, tall and indistinct, moved at the end of the hallway. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I stared down the corridor, my heart hammering in my chest. There was nothing there, just the empty stretch of polished floor and the faint glow of a light in the distance. But I was sure of what I'd seen. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it. Maybe it was a trick of the light or my mind playing games with me, but as I continued walking, the unease only grew. I felt like I was being followed, though every time I turned around, the hallway was empty. Back in my room, I locked the door and leaned against it, struggling to catch my breath. My hands were shaking, and my thoughts raced. Was it just my imagination, or was there something, or someone, lurking in the shadows of this house? The next day, I was summoned to the living room. Diddy was waiting for me, seated casually on a sleek leather couch. The room was immaculate, every detail carefully curated to exude wealth and power. He looked up as I entered, a smile playing at the corners of his lips. But it wasn't a warm smile. It was sharp, calculated. "Have a seat," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. I hesitated but obeyed, perching on the edge of the chair like I might need to bolt at any moment. "I hear you've been, curious," he said, his tone light but carrying an unmistakable weight. "That's not necessarily a bad thing. Curiosity can be useful." I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. "I'm just trying to do my job." His smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good. That's what I like to hear. Because this is a very important job. And in this house, we value trust above all else." "I can take raccoons for one I have," I told Sai, rubbing my hands lightly over my face. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking onto mine. "But trust is a delicate thing. It can be easily broken, and once it's broken, it's very hard to fix. Do you understand?" The implied threat hung heavy in the air, pressing down on me like a physical weight. "Yes," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. The Vietnamese woman grabbed some of my free hand, which had remained in her pocket. "Good," he said, leaning back again. "I knew I could count on you." The meeting ended as abruptly as it began, and I left the room feeling like the walls were closing in around me. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a job anymore. It was a trap, and I had no idea how to escape it. That evening, as I walked the child to their playroom, they clutched my hand tightly, their little fingers trembling. They didn't say much, but as we reached the door, they stopped abruptly and looked up at me. "Oh, you shouldn't have talked to him," they whispered, their voice quivering. I crouched down to meet their eyes, concern tightening in my chest. "Why do you say that?" They looked around nervously, as if afraid someone might overhear. "He doesn't like it when people ask too many questions. He doesn't like it when people see too much." I tried to reassure them, though my own fear was mounting. "It's okay. We're going to be fine." The child shook their head. "You have to be careful. They're always watching." As I tucked them into bed later that night, their words lingered in my mind, joining the growing storm of unease and paranoia. The shadows in the hallways, the staff's hostility, Diddy's veiled warnings. It all painted a picture of something far darker than I could have imagined. I sat on the edge of my bed that night, staring at the locked door and wondering how much longer I could stay in this house. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I knew it wasn't that simple. Not anymore. Chapter 7. The Attempted Escape. The day began like all the others, but it didn't stay that way for long. The child seemed quieter than usual, their small frame tense, as if bracing for something inevitable. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted overnight, the oppressive air in the house thicker than ever. It wasn't long before I found out why. They were by the dining room bed. I was organizing some of the child's toys in the playroom when I heard raised voices from the hallway. One of them was unmistakably Diddy's, sharp, commanding, his words cutting through the air like a blade. The other voice, smaller and more fragile, was the child's. I moved to the door and cracked it open just enough to see. Diddy stood towering over the child, his posture stiff with authority. His voice was low but forceful, the kind of tone that didn't tolerate disobedience. The child cowered, their head bowed, and their tiny fists clenched at their sides. "You don't question me," Diddy said, his words deliberate and cold. "You do what you're told. Always." The child nodded meekly, tears streaming down their cheeks. My stomach churned as I watched him grab their arm too tightly and lean down to whisper something I couldn't hear. The child flinched, their small frame trembling under his grip. Something inside me snapped. I couldn't watch this anymore. I couldn't stay in this house another moment, and I sure as hell wasn't leaving without that child. That evening, I waited until the house was at its quietest. Most of the staff had retired to their quarters, and the heavy stillness that draped the estate worked in my favor. I packed a small bag for the child, just a few essentials, and whispered my plan to them. "We're leaving tonight," I said softly, kneeling beside their bed. "We're going to a safe place. You don't have to stay here anymore." The child's wide eyes searched mine, a mix of hope and fear swirling in their gaze. "But they'll find us," they whispered, their voice cracking. "No, they won't," I assured them, even as doubt clawed at the edges of my mind. "I'll keep you safe. I promise." After a moment, they nodded, clutching their eerie stuffed animal tightly. It was enough to break my heart, but I pushed it aside. I had to focus. If I couldn't do something myself, no one else could. We moved through the house like shadows, careful not to make a sound. I knew the security staff rotated shifts, and I'd memorized their patterns over the past few weeks. Every step felt like a gamble. My nerves stretched taut as we crept toward the side exit near the kitchen. Just as we reached the door, the child tugged on my sleeve. "Wait," they whispered, their voice trembling. They lifted their arms slightly, and that's when I saw them. Faint, but unmistakable bruises circling their wrists. My breath caught in my throat, anger and sorrow swelling inside me. "We're leaving," I said firmly, crouching to look them in the eye. "No one will hurt you again." The child nodded, tears welling in their eyes. I placed a comforting hand on their shoulder and turned back to the door. We were so close. "So you're not feeling too good?" I asked, their dark, somber eyes looking at me with lids that held little light. I opened it slowly, the cool night air washing over us like a wave of freedom. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope, but it didn't last. The sound of footsteps behind us shattered the fragile silence. Before I could react, a flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing squarely on us. "Stop right there," a deep voice commanded. I turned, shielding the child behind me as two security guards approached, their expressions cold and unyielding. Panic surged through me as they closed the distance, their movements swift and deliberate. "Please," I started, my voice shaking. "We just need to leave." One of the guards ignored me and grabbed my arm, yanking me backward with enough force to make me stumble. The child screamed, clutching my hand tightly until another guard pried them away. "Let them go," I shouted, struggling against the iron grip holding me. "They're just a kid." But my pleas fell on deaf ears. The guards dragged us back inside, their silence more unnerving than any threat they could have spoken. They took us to the living room, where Diddy was waiting. He was seated in the same leather chair as before, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp and unreadable. He gestured for the guards to release us, and they did, though their presence lingered like a warning. "I'm disappointed," he said calmly, his tone measured but cold. "I thought we had an understanding." I stood tall, placing myself between him and the child. "This isn't right," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "You can't treat them like this." Diddy raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "And what exactly do you think is happening here?" "I've seen enough," I snapped. "The bruises, the cameras, the rules. It's not normal. None of this is." His smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You don't understand the first thing about this house or what goes on here. You think you're saving someone, but you're just breaking something that doesn't need to be fixed." I felt the child's small hand clutch mine, their grip trembling. They looked up at me, tears streaming down their face. "They'll find us wherever we go," they whispered, their voice barely audible. The weight of their words hit me like a punch to the gut. I realized, in that moment, the depth of the control Diddy and his network had over this house, this child, this entire situation. It wasn't just physical, it was psychological. An invisible cage with no escape. Diddy stood, his presence towering over me. He gestured to the guards, who stepped forward. My heart raced as they grabbed my arms again, pulling me away from the child. "No, don't do this," I screamed, thrashing against their grip. "Please, let them go. They don't deserve this." Diddy knelt in front of the child, his tone eerily gentle. "Go to your room," he said. "We'll talk later." Weirin laughed. The child hesitated, looking at me with wide, tearful eyes. "It's okay," I said, forcing my voice to sound steady even as panic consumed me. "Just go. I'll be fine." They nodded reluctantly and disappeared down the hallway, their small figures swallowed by the shadows. I turned back to Diddy, my heart pounding. Whatever came next, I knew it wouldn't be good. Chapter 8. The Aftermath. The night air was cool but suffocating as the guards dragged me out of the house, their iron grips unrelenting. My protests had long since faded into silence, my voice hoarse and raw. The ornate front doors loomed behind me like a gate sealing off a world I was never meant to enter. The mansion's lights glowed eerily, casting long shadows that stretched toward the edge of the circular driveway. Diddy stood at the entrance, watching as I was unceremoniously shoved toward the black SUV waiting near the curb. His expression was calm, unreadable, but his words lingered like a warning shot. "You'll forget everything," he said, his voice low but carrying a weight that chilled me to my core. "For your own good, trust me on that." I opened my mouth to argue, to say something, but the look in his eyes stopped me. There was no anger, no rage, just a quiet certainty that I knew too much. As the SUV's door slammed shut, sealing me inside, I realized he didn't need to threaten me outright. The message was clear enough: to find it in myself. The drive back to my apartment felt like a blur. The city lights streaked past the windows, but I barely noticed them. My mind raced, replaying everything that had happened. The child's whispered warnings, the bruises on their wrists, the oppressive sense of being watched. It all clung to me like a second skin. When the car finally pulled up outside my building, the driver didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His eyes met mine in the rearview mirror, cold and detached, as if silently reminding me of the rules. I stepped out of the car, the bag I'd hastily packed still clutched in my hands, and the SUV disappeared into the night. Back in my apartment, this silence was deafening. The familiar surroundings that should have offered comfort instead felt alien, as though the house's oppressive energy had followed me home. I locked the door behind me, sliding the deadbolt into place with trembling hands. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a notification from an unknown number. I hesitated before checking it. The message was short and to the point. "You're safe as long as you stay quiet. Don't test us." My stomach sank. My first instinct was to delete the message, but my fingers hovered over the screen. What did they mean by safe? How far were they willing to go to ensure my silence? The days that followed were a waking nightmare. At first, I thought it was just paranoia, my mind playing tricks on me after everything I'd seen. The phone calls started next. At odd hours, my phone would ring, but when I answered, there was no one on the other end, just silence. Sometimes I thought I could hear faint breathing, but it was hard to tell if it was real or just my imagination. I started letting the calls go to voicemail, but they never left messages. My sleep was restless, plagued by dreams of the child's tearful face and the shadows that had haunted the house. One night, I woke with a start, convinced I'd heard whispering. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent a shiver down my spine. "They're still watching you," the voice seemed to say. I sat up, scanning the room, but there was no one there. The shadows in the corners felt deeper, more oppressive, but the apartment was empty, or at least, it looked that way. The thought of going to the police crossed my mind more than once, but what could I say? That I'd been fired from a babysitting job and now felt like I was being watched. It sounded absurd, even to me. And besides, who would believe me? The people involved were powerful, untouchable. The kind of people who could make problems disappear without leaving a trace. I considered reaching out to the child welfare authorities, but then I remembered the child's whispered words. "They'll find us wherever we go." What if trying to help them only made things worse? For both of us, the evidence I had was slim, just my memories and the faint bruises I'd seen on the child's wrists. But the weight of the truth pressed down on me, refusing to let me move on. I couldn't shake the feeling that by doing nothing, I was complicit in whatever horrors were happening in that house. One night, after another round of sleepless hours spent staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and started drafting an email. The journalist I chose wasn't just anyone. They were known for uncovering corruption, for taking down powerful people who thought they were untouchable. If anyone could bring the truth to light, it was them. The cursor blinked at me, mocking my hesitation. I typed out everything I could remember, recounting the rules, the red room, the child's warnings, and Diddy's cryptic threats. I tried to be as detailed as possible, but with every word, the fear in my chest grew heavier. When I finished, I attached a file containing my written account and hovered over the send button. My finger trembled. Sending the email would be a declaration of war against people who had the resources to destroy me. But doing nothing felt like an even greater betrayal of the child, of myself, of everything I'd witnessed. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the screen. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the laptop. My thoughts swirled, a storm of doubt and fear. What if they're watching me right now? What if sending this gets me killed? And then, somewhere in the back of my mind, I heard the child's voice again. They'll find us wherever we go. I took a deep breath, my chest tightening as I pressed my finger against the trackpad. The cursor hovered over the send button, a single click away from changing everything. But then I froze. A sound, a faint creak, like the weight of a footstep, echoed from the hallway outside my apartment. My head snapped toward the door, my pulse quickening. The sound came again, closer this time. I slammed the laptop shut and sat perfectly still, straining to hear. The apartment was quiet once more, but the sense of being watched was stronger than ever. My hand moved toward my phone, ready to call someone, anyone. But I stopped myself. Who could I call, and what would I say? I turned back to the laptop, but my resolve wavered. The email sat unsent, the truth trapped in a digital purgatory. As the hours passed, I stayed at my desk, the weight of the decision crushing me. Outside, the faint sound of a car engine idling reached my ears. I didn't have to look to know it was one of them. I stared at the laptop screen, the cursor still blinking. The decision was mine to make, but either choice felt like a trap. In the end, I didn't hit send. Not yet. But I left the laptop open, the email ready, and whispered a silent promise to the child. For now, I just had to survive.